Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: markets soar as tariffs fall, and President Trump claiming a big win. Is this the beginning of the end or just a pause in the U.S.-China trade war? President Trump says China agreed it will stop sending fentanyl to America. Despite that, the existing 20% tariff punishing Beijing for its role in the drug crisis remains in place. Chinese-made devices. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer met with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng over the weekend in Switzerland. By Monday, the two countries had issued a joint statement signaling a temporary but significant deal, slashing tariffs and injecting optimism into global markets. Stocks surged and the U.S. dollar climbed sharply. It marks the biggest breakthrough in U.S.-China tariff war since April 2nd. President Trump outlined it as a big win on Monday as Washington and Beijing agreed to dial down tariffs for the time being.
Yesterday, we achieved a total reset with China.
Starting Wednesday, May 14th, the U.S. will lower its tariffs on Chinese imports from 145% to 30%. The new number includes an existing 20% levy tied to fentanyl enforcement. China, in turn, will reduce its duties on American goods from 125% to 10%. The pause will last for 90 days. Total trade between U.S. and China reached $585 billion as of last year. $440 billion of that number came from goods the U.S. imported from China. But according to President Trump, the real victory wasn't about numbers. It was about leverage.
The best part of the deal was that we opened up China. China agreed to open itself up to American business to go in. China will also suspend and remove all of its non-monetary barriers. They've agreed to do that.
President Trump says tariffs could go substantially higher if no long-term deal is reached after the 90-day window. But he also assured they won't return to the previous 145% level.
I think they're going to follow through. I think they want it very badly. I think they want the deal very badly. Again, this doesn't include the steel tariffs that I put on a long time ago.
Echoing the president's stance, Secretary Bessent emphasized the importance of economic security and trade restructuring.
We do not want a generalized decoupling from China, but what we do want is a decoupling for strategic necessities, which we were unable to obtain during COVID.
Beyond the temporary tariff relief, both sides agreed to set up a new trade consultation mechanism to maintain ongoing dialogue. Secretary Bessent says another round of talks is expected in the coming weeks to get a more comprehensive agreement. Adding to that, President Trump says a meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping is on the horizon. Besides opening up China's market to American businesses, Trump said on Monday that China has agreed to stop sending fentanyl into the U.S. That statement comes as part of the weekend trade talks. Here's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent unpacking the details on the Chinese side earlier on Monday. Watch.
They brought the Deputy Minister for Public Safety, who is not traditionally part of the trade team or the negotiating team, and he had a very robust and highly detailed discussion with someone from the U.S. National Security Team.
The Chinese official Bessent mentioned is Wang Xiaohong, who serves as the head of China's law enforcement. Analysts say Wang's attendance signals that Beijing is taking the issue seriously.
The Chinese have very draconian measures for the sale of illicit narcotics in China, and we have asked them to be equally as draconian with the people who are poisoning Americans.
Selling illicit fentanyl is a felony in China. People involved in the crime may face punishment as severe as the death penalty. It's worth noting sending Beijing's security czar to the meeting marks a big shift in China's attitude. When the trade war just started last month, Beijing dismissed U.S. calls to fix the fentanyl issue, arguing it's a U.S. problem, not China's. Here's the kicker. China is central to America's opioid crisis. The country is where most fentanyl precursor chemicals come from. According to the U.S., the chemicals move through criminal organizations, passing through Mexico and other countries where cartels press them into pills and smuggle them into the U.S. The fentanyl crisis has been a top concern of the Trump administration. According to the Drug Enforcement Administration, fentanyl overdose is a leading cause of death among Americans ages 18 to 45. Trump reiterated Monday that even with lower tariff rates, the 30% rate still includes 20% to punish the country for its role in the flow of fentanyl. China signaling it's not willing to drop restrictions on rare earth minerals early on Monday. That's after both the U.S. and China agreed to lower their tariffs to 10%, plus another 20% from the U.S. for fentanyl, plus other agreements. The information comes from an official Weibo account run by Chinese state media. Weibo is often considered China's version of X. The post also included a hashtag translated to China's restrictions on rare earth minerals are still in place. The post adds that the U.S. defense industry is deeply reliant on China for key materials, adding the U.S. won't be able to find alternative suppliers. It also reported that Chinese authorities have been ramping up efforts to crack down on smuggling activities linked to these exports. Rare earth minerals are widely used in various electronic devices, from batteries, semiconductors, and AirPods to satellites and weapons. Get this, nearly 70% of global rare earth production is from China. But it's not only about the reserve. China has the upper hand in refining technology, too. Nearly 90% of the world's rare earth minerals are processed by Chinese refineries. Zooming back out, with the Chinese Communist Party looming over such critical supplies, here's what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent hinted about the U.S. direction going forward. He called it strategic rebalancing.
I would say one of the big takeaways from this weekend, the United States will continue a strategic rebalancing in many areas that were exposed as supply chain weaknesses, and we will continue moving toward U.S. independence or reliable supplies from allies on those. But the consensus from both delegations this weekend is neither side wants a decoupling.
Beijing added 7 rare earth minerals and related items to its export control list last month as part of its tariff retaliation. The move requires foreign clients to obtain a license before purchasing these minerals. There is only one rare earth mine sitting on U.S. soil right now, the Mountain Pass mine in California. The company is ramping up production of certain key minerals ever since the tariff war started. What's more, the U.S. and Ukraine inked a rare earth mineral deal earlier this month. It's a major part of White House efforts to diversify supply chains. To discuss the U.S.-China trade deal further, we spoke earlier with Daniel Lacaille, chief economist at Truce and author of Freedom or Equality, and Adam Savitt, director of the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. Here's a look at what they make of the length of these talks.
I think that the reason why we have seen such a quick and I would say that detailed process is because the situation for China was getting very, very challenging after the UK deal. We must remember that the UK-US trade deal cemented a position for the United Kingdom in terms of the supply chains that would compromise a lot of the elements that help China maintain a very strong exporting position. And at the same time, we saw that exports to the United States from China fell by a fifth in April. All those elements added to the deflationary spiral that China is suffering have probably made the Chinese delegation be very diligent about reaching something that could be presented as something that is positive for everybody, and that immediately lifts the challenges for the exporters, for ports, and also for the freight carriers.
And Adam, to your earlier point, given the history of the Chinese regime not playing by international rules and norms, how do you see Trump 2.0 handling the Chinese regime this time around when it comes to ensuring follow through? For instance, Beijing did not keep their end of the deal during the first Trump administration.
It was enacted in 2020. Everyone kind of knew that China was not living up to their end of that bargain, but formally, this was not addressed until President Trump's America First trade policy was released in January of this year. And the USTR came back with a report just last month underlining the fact that China did not hold up their end of the bargain. So we need something different this time. I would hope to see something like actual punitive measures. Let's say if China doesn't come through with initial good faith steps, so we could have a snapback to the 145% tariffs. Let's use trust but verify to harken back to the Soviet Union, the Cold War, meaning that there should be a presumption that China is not fulfilling its end of the bargain. And we just need to look at its track record, not just the phase one deal, but going back 20 to 30 years, going back to its obligations under the WTO that it was supposed to follow for all the advantages it would get for the WTO. And number three, just look at the evidence in front of our eyes. One example, the 2018-19 tariffs that went on China, we saw a doubling or tripling of the trade deficit with Vietnam. Why did that happen? Because they used Vietnam as a pass-through. So let's look at evidence like that right in front of our eyes and make the judgment before a formal report on the matter might have time to be released.
On to public health. The U.S. relies on China for pharmaceuticals. Experts have long voiced concerns that this poses a national security threat in the case that the U.S. might not be able to mass produce life-saving drugs. Here to break this down is NTD's data reporter Kevin Hogan for a discussion on U.S. reliance on China and President Trump's possible solution.
The U.S. is very reliant on China for medicine, and that's what we're looking at right here. That's the Communist China's chokehold on U.S. medicine. Why do I say that? Well, nearly all imports of penicillin or the anti-inflammatory hydrocortisone come from China, and about half the imports of penicillin do, right? So what did we learn from the pandemic? Well, the U.S. Congress says that it exposed a vulnerability in the U.S. healthcare system, its reliance on China, because exports, for the most part, stopped coming. Now, will President Trump's tariffs, which are subject to change on China, cause some of these drug prices to rise? It's unclear, but President Trump wants to flip the script because here's what he says. Check this out. So we do not make our own drugs anymore. The drug companies are in Ireland and they're in lots of other places, China, and all I have to do is impose a tariff the faster they move in. So those tariffs, he thinks, will cause these companies to reshore their production in the United States, right? So where does all the United States get its products that make these drugs, right? These are the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and those are the things that go into making medicine, right? So in 2020, a couple years ago, the United States was making about half. These are domestic, and then the other half are imported, whether it's in the form of finished medicine or it's in the form of these APIs, right? So if you look further into this, you say, okay, you come up a couple years, this is 2024 data, where are those imports of those APIs and other, these over-the-counter APIs coming from? Well, most of them are coming from Singapore. That's about $1 billion in just 1 year, but China, look at this. It's a major supplier of all these, right? So, you have Germany and India, like President Trump said, they're all over the world, not in the United States, right? Well, to some extent, that is the case. And now, you fast forward and you say, all right, here, right nowadays, how much has the exports to China changed, right? So you're just looking at all exports, that just means that this is the change since 2016, so it's positive. That just means that there's more trade going on, right? But when you look at pharmaceuticals, that's when this really comes up. So the U.S. exports to China went up quite a bit. I mean, that's 400%. But the imports to China, look, that's almost 600% more since 2016. So that's a very, very, very stark increase, right? And at that rate, you might ask, well, what is it that the United States is doing? Well, it's trading more, but specifically, it's becoming more and more reliant on China for its medical supplies. And that's the key takeaway right here. So we go into, the United States, this is a claim made by the Rosemary Gibson, who spoke to Jan Jekielek in the American Thought Leaders program, and she's citing experts and saying that the U.S. relies on China for 95% of all of the key ingredients for generic drugs. Think about it. generic drugs are pretty cheap because the manufacturer's margins are razor thin. So a lot of that is coming from China. And the same expert, Gibson, that we just mentioned, she says that we have a system that is perfectly designed for catastrophic failure and significant loss of human life, and that has to change. So at this rate, you might ask, well, what can the United States do? Well, again, President Trump, he wants to onshore things using tariffs. Will Congress codify some of those rules into law, or will there be some negotiations in Geneva that lead to more of these drugs being able to be sourced in the United States? We'll have to see. And this is very important because the medical industry is something that these two major economic powers, the United States and China, have a very, very big underlying relationship, and that's what needs to be addressed. So we're going to be tracking this for you.
Coming up, these may look and act like video games, but they're really vaping devices and are more likely to get kids addicted to them. The FDA now taking countermeasures against the Chinese-made devices. Beijing hosting a major forum to court Latin American trade partners. That says China and the U.S. slash tariffs to defuse the trade war. How successful is Beijing's courting?
At the end of the day, I think the leaders of these countries know better than to count on Beijing.
And Taiwan test fires a new U.S. rocket system for the first time, a strong signal to China as the island bolsters national defense in the face of a possible invasion. That and more after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Vaping devices from China have flooded the U.S. market, but a specific type has taken their addictive potential to a new level. FDA Commissioner Dr. Marty Makary says the U.S. will confiscate addictive Chinese-made vaping devices that look and act like video games. Here's more.
Dubbed smart vapes, experts are warning about the danger of the vaping devices targeting youth with built-in video games, calling, and music features. Some of them are installed with speakers, fitness trackers, and Bluetooth connection. The FDA last October warned online retailers and manufacturers to stop selling and distributing these. China is reportedly making these new smart vapes designed to get kids addicted and conceal the nicotine from parents. Dr. Makary says the U.S. has been sending them back while China is shopping around for U.S. ports that will accept them.
Despite the trade war pause between Beijing and Washington, the Chinese regime is still challenging U.S. dominance in Latin America. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held talks with Caribbean and Latin American delegations Monday, one day ahead of a key summit with trade partners in Latin America. The presidents of Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, plus several Latin American and Caribbean officials, are slated to attend the summit. The gathering comes as Beijing and Washington work to defuse their trade war. Wang said China is willing to deepen cooperation with countries in the Caribbean region and chart a blueprint for the next decade. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is set to speak at the summit. It's the first time he will have addressed the forum in 10 years. Beijing has been trying to set up a global coalition against U.S. tariffs. It has reached out to Southeast Asia and Central Asia, calling on them to hold a line against the U.S. Meanwhile, China has been looking for alternatives amid the trade war with the U.S. Similar to how the U.S. is looking to cut reliance on China, China has also been on the lookout for supply alternatives to the U.S. Last week, it signed a deal to buy $900 million worth of soybeans, corn, and vegetable oil from Argentina. Brazil also announced 2 Chinese partnerships Monday, including a $1 billion investment by China's Envision Energy. The country's president is currently visiting China. Brazil is also in talks with China to build a railway connecting the Chancay port in Peru to regions of Brazil. The port was developed by a Chinese state-owned company. Likewise, Colombia has voiced plans to sign onto China's Belt and Road Initiative. Through the infrastructure project, Beijing offers billions of dollars in loans to less developed countries, usually to build infrastructure with strategic significance. The Belt and Road is widely criticized in the West. That's because when countries fail to pay back their massive Chinese debt, the regime often takes control of the strategic assets it helped build, like seaports, that could prove useful for military purposes. Jacqueline Deal is the president and CEO of Long-Term Strategy Group. She said these Latin American countries understand that it would be a mistake to throw in their lot with Beijing.
I think we're going to see the CCP do a full court press in the coming months to do what they would call South-to-South diplomacy and court these countries. But at the end of the day, I think the leaders of these countries know better than to count on Beijing. I think they know that the CCP is not a reliable, trustworthy interlocutor.
The Trump administration has also worked to strengthen ties with Latin America. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first international visit in his capacity was to the region. What's more, the Trump White House is trying to peel China's influence away from the Panama Canal, a strategically important waterway for both civil and military transportation. A powerful display of firepower in the Pacific, Taiwan has test-fired a new U.S.-supplied rocket system for the first time. A Taiwanese Defense Ministry officer on Monday said U.S. personnel on site made sure everything went off without any issues.
I believe that this rocket firing shows our country's people the military's determination to protect the country's security and safeguard our beautiful homeland.
Taiwan's been facing increased military pressure from Beijing. In recent months, China has been increasing its presence in the Taiwan Strait, flying over the region and sailing closer to Taiwan. Under a U.S. law called the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. is required to supply Taiwan with weapons. That's to support its self-defense capabilities. While the U.S. and Taiwan lack formal diplomatic ties, Washington remains Taiwan's most important arms supplier. Taiwan purchased 29 precision rocket systems from Lockheed Martin, the same models used by Ukraine in the war against Russia. The rockets have a range of 186 miles, allowing them to reach the China coast when launched from Taiwan. The launches highlight Taiwan's growing capability to fight back against a potential Chinese invasion. That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. Round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.